And this class is the happy recipient of our next lesson on Song of Songs. And it's hard to tell which I like doing better because the Torah portions are still so rich. I mean, we don't seem to run out of good stuff. We just seem to get into deeper good stuff. But with Song of Songs, the strangest thing is happening. And those of you who have been with us a while, you remember a few years back when we were doing workbook 2 so that I could revise it. And so we would do workbook 2 on one day and do the Torah portion on another day. And it was really strange how the two things would just synchronize. It was almost like you had planned it. And that's what I'm finding out as we're doing Song of Songs. Even, topics that came up last night, it kind of blew my mind because it's like, well, it's already in the PowerPoint for tomorrow. And as I was listening to the YouTube, I'm having fits with YouTube right now. So if you're having trouble clicking on a YouTube link, it's legitimately a problem. They're somehow trying to fight my uploads. And then once they're uploaded, they tend to get unchecked. Like they just lose their place. They're still there, but they're not where I put them. And so I'm having to re-upload some things. And so I was checking this morning because I lost that red monster. It got lost. I don't know if you tried to click on it. It'll take you through there, but it wasn't in your playlist. And I just now, I re-uploaded it, and I think I finally got it into your playlist where it'll stay instead of slither around like the monster that it is. But your Zoom links always seem to be good, but YouTube right now is, maybe they're overloaded. I don't know. But so I was letting, it just pulled up my most viewed video, I guess, of the day or whatever's most viewed right now. And it was The Little Informer. And I'm like, oh my goodness, that was last night's class. It was just seamless how those things fit together. And you can't really plan that. That has to be his timeline, his divine appointment. And so we just want to be sensitive to it and say, what can we learn from this? That he does have a calendar, but he will also use the place where you are. That's the message of Acts chapter 2. There were lots of converts, lots of proselytes who had come up to Jerusalem to celebrate Shavuot, but he was kind enough. He spoke to them in a known tongue. He knew where they were with their language and with their culture and so forth, and he spoke into that. And I think he's continuing to do that. He's using the cycle of the Torah portions. He's even using, our extra study that we picked for this year. He's using Song of Songs and just showing us, what, it's all connected. It's just like the Holy Spirit. We talk about wisdom and understanding and knowledge and so forth, but it's one Holy Spirit. And I want to show you what it means to be one, because that's our statement of faith. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. He's one. And it's so difficult for us as we're trying to learn things and learn one thing at a time to really grasp how he is so many things at one time. And so we artificially tend to separate this, and then there's this, and then there's this, when actually it's all that. But he will let you learn it in little packages. He will speak to he will speak to you in that package where you are today, if you'll allow him to. And which we didn't get that far into the lesson last night. I wanted to go back to where Yeshua was troubled in his spirit, where he says, my soul, my nefesh, it's in tribulation right now, is literally what he said. And how the people standing by had different perceptions of what just happened. And it's the same with us, based on how good our hearing is, how tuned in we are to his spirit, we all might hear or perceive something differently. And it would be the very same event. We would hear the very same words and yet construe them differently based on where we are today in our walk with him. based on our life experiences and so forth. So it is a challenge to bring everybody together to where we're all hearing, hopefully, pretty much the same thing, and not reading the wrong things into the words. So we'll move forward with that challenge. I will share which screen? This one. And just to review, we are still in chapter 1 of the Song of Songs. Last week, we looked at the daughters. We needed to define who daughters can be. Contextually, a daughter can just be a daughter. It's just literal, simple, no big deal. On the other hand, we know that daughters can refer to dependent systems. In other words, we had the example of how, say, a primary city could have daughter cities or dependent cities. Their economy, their growth, their security, and so forth depended upon the health of the mother city. And of course, the ultimate mother city is Jerusalem, and she will have her dependents. She will have offspring who depend upon her for life and health and peace and prosperity and so forth. And because the reason I'm doing that is to bring you into this week's lesson, which is right here. Now I will blow it up. I mean, not literally. That's probably how you get banned from YouTube, blowing things up. Okay, so contextually, she says, "O daughters of Jerusalem." All right, that's her context. This is her audience. This is who she's speaking to, the daughters of Jerusalem, the dependent people or the dependent groups who perceive Jerusalem as their mother. And of course, there's two possible mothers, Paul tells us. There is Sarah, who's Jerusalem above. She's Jerusalem of the Spirit. And then there's Hagar, who would be Mount Sinai below, and we would have a slavish relationship to his word. That's what you saw at Mount Sinai. The second Moses is out of sight. You sense them descending into a slavish relationship to the word that they've been given, and it didn't take very many days at all, less than 40 days, for them to act upon that slavish relationship to the word. Because if you're a slave, you're being forced. You feel the pressure, you feel the obligation only. You're not perceiving the spirit of it, because that takes the relationship, again, of the free woman, of the mother above, the spiritual relationship. This is the relationship that Moshe had with the Torah. He's the one who ascended to receive the Torah. He's the one whose face glowed. He's the one who could receive the message mouth to mouth. When we looked at those different levels of prophecy, like Moses is as close as you get to the mouth of Elohim. And then there were descending levels of prophecy, like you might receive the message through an angel and so forth. But the relationship, the daughters of Jerusalem, we want to be the daughters of Jerusalem above. We want to obey the Torah. We want to obey the word that's given, but we don't want to do it slavishly. We want to do it with the power of the Holy Spirit, because if the Spirit's not moving through the words, then we will descend into a slavish relationship, and at the first opportunity, we'll run away. Or at the first opportunity, we'll be like Hagar, we'll start mocking. We'll have a bad attitude. We'll develop a bad attitude about it. We'll start quarreling with one another. And you can tell when we descend into that Hagar relationship, because we start quarreling with one another. We start behaving like slaves. And Sarah above is saying, hey, look up here. Look up here. Look at me. Look at me. Look at mama. Eyes on me, right? And so that's just a great life lesson for your kids or grandkids, whoever you're teaching, to teach them the two different relationships to the Torah. And that if we're going to be the children of Sarah, if we're going to be her daughters, her dependents, then we must depend upon the spirit of the Torah to walk with us in walking out the Torah. So this address where she's addressing the daughters of Jerusalem, she's not addressing people who are estranged from the covenant. They have a familiarity with it. Now, for some reason, they're looking at her in a less than favorable manner. In fact, in the next verse, we'll see an even more intensive address. Not only is she mentioning I'm black, like the tents of Kedar, she will follow up and she will say, don't stare at me because I'm black. Don't stare at me because I'm swarthy. And she'll tell why she's swarthy. It'll explain why she's swarthy. But it's giving us the impression that these daughters of Jerusalem might look at this beloved who's coming in, and her appearance is a little dark and raggedy because she's been out in the sun, and they don't exactly know who she is. And what they're noticing is how dark she is. They're not noticing the person beneath. They're not noticing that person's relationship to the Father. They're not noticing the person's relationship to Sarah, to Jerusalem above. All they're noticing is the exterior, where she seems to have come from. And if we forget that we are still in that last exile of Rome, of Edom, if we forget that, then we will tend to look at people as if they are coming from a strange place, forgetting that we are also coming from strange places. So we tend to view one another with suspicion as we go back and move closer and closer to Jerusalem and into that perfect will. But we get the sense right here that she's justifying herself. She's saying, yes, I'm black, but I'm black like the tents of Kedar. She's trying to explain her dark color that's distinguishing her as she comes back. And so we look at who is Kedar. Kedar was the second son of Ishmael. So he is an Ishmaelite. That's in Genesis 25:13, if I typed it right. His descendants became nomads. We might today call them Bedouin. We might today also call them Arabs. There's a mixing in of the peoples, but his characteristic, the reason she would pick out Kedar specifically as one of the Ishmaelites that she looks like, is because he was a nomad. So there is a nomadic quality to her. In other words, she's a traveler. She doesn't have a permanent home. In fact, last night, if you'll remember, we broke down the covenant between the pieces and the prophecy to Abraham that told of not just of the exile in Egypt and that nation would be punished, but it also hinted to the four kingdoms of the beast. And so it gave the three sojournings, and then the fourth that we're currently in. We had the sojourning of Abraham in a land not his own, the sojourning of Isaac in a land not his own, the sojourning of Jacob, and then when they do cross over the Jordan, that's when they inherit. That's when they lose the status there of sojourners. Even though they are in their own land, they're only sojourning in it. So that started the time clock of the 400 years. And then we looked at the last exile, the last sojourning, which we are still in. And so there will be a process of those who are still in exile, those who are still sojourning, bringing them also across the Jordan and implanting them into the land so that they are no longer sojourners, but inheritors of the promise and the promised land. So if you use that equivalency, that most of Israel at this moment is still sojourning in the places of their exile. Therefore, we're like the travelers, we're nomads. And especially, I know we got lots of South Africans on here in the Tuesday class and other countries where your time is probably evening right now. But especially in the United States, maybe not in other countries, but especially in the United States, we are nomads. Ever since, I would say, probably World War II, the Dust Bowl, if you know the history of the Dust Bowl, you have people who just pick up and move. They'll go to a city looking for work. And so you have lots of people in Indianapolis today who moved there for work, but they were born in Indianapolis, but their parents were from the hills of Kentucky. Basically, our whole in Los Angeles, our whole circle of friends were people who their families had moved to California during an economic boom. And then as they retired, they started moving back to places like Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama, Oklahoma, wherever they had come from. We are very much nomads, and we move where there's grass for the sheep, so to speak. So we're a great example of what it means to be Black, like the Tents of Kedar. And in the Midrash, it says the Tents of Kedar, even though they appear ugly, black, and ragged from the outside. And if any of you have ever been down to Tamar with us, you know that we have the Abraham's tent there that was donated, a Bedouin tent, or maybe some of the men have gone over and had tea at, what's his name? Is it Muhammad? Who's the Bedouin family that's adjacent to the park. If you've been around one of those tents, it's exactly what they are. They're ugly, they're black, and unless they're brand new, they're a little raggedy from the outside, because in that hot desert sun, they have that weathered look, right? It's from the outside, you would think they're very poor. From the outside, you know, especially today, you might see them tapped into a power line. And, you know, you might see fences for the goats just made of a bunch of old sticks. But yet, if you go inside the tent, they might have a big screen TV. They have all sorts of things inside the tent. But from the outside, which goes back to they have a very strong belief in the evil eye, that you don't want to do things to draw attention to yourself and any wealth that you might have. And so when you view their tent from the outside, you think, well, they're just dirt poor. They don't have anything. But, you know, if you go inside, you can find out they have very fine clothes. They might have very nice appliances. And at the time of the actual Tents of Kedar, they were often full of precious stones and pearls because they were traders. And precious stones and pearls are things that you can carry easily and conceal easily. And so it traveled well. So when it says the Tents of Kedar, it's world building for us. It's helping us to picture that world, what it looked like, who it was, and what it was about them that distinguished them. They were nomads. They had an exterior appearance of being a little raggedy and weather worn, but from the inside, they were full of wealth, full of precious stones and pearls. And the sages equated the Tents of Kedar, again, going back to the maidens who were made glad. if we put those two together, then we end up with a maiden who might look ugly and raggedy on the outside, but inside of her, they say, is much Torah knowledge, because, the Torah is equated, the word is more precious than silver, more costly than gold. It's even the virtuous woman, her price is far above rubies. And so the Tents of Kedar, even though it in a simple sense, it is ugly and raggedy, but the world that it builds for us is that inside there's a beautiful maiden, and she's full of Torah knowledge. And they point out the precious stones that the nomads would go around with. And so we can equate that with what we're told about being precious stones and living stones. And we can make that connection now, where she says, "Oh, daughters of Jerusalem, don't look at me because I'm black. Don't look at me because I'm swarthy, as if I'm deficient or, somebody not worth having among you, because inside of me is Torah knowledge. Inside of me is precious stones, that I'm a living stone of New Jerusalem, that Sarah above is my mother, that there is a spiritual beauty inside of me that you haven't seen yet. It's well concealed on the outside, but inside of me, it's awesome." They also make the comment, and it's taken from Leviticus 26:13, that just as no man's yoke is upon the tents of Kedar. In other words, they were nomads, so they didn't really submit to any king. If they didn't like the conditions, they just pick up and move, which that sounds familiar. I know lots of nomads in the faith. If they don't like where they are, they just pick up and move. But they say that in the same way that the nomads would rather move repeatedly than submit to the yoke of a human being, it says, so in the Messianic kingdom, under Messiah's reign, no man's yoke will be upon the people of Israel. They will have the yoke of the kingdom itself. And Yeshua gave us a little heads up, and maybe he was even referring to this understanding of Song of Songs when he said it. He says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. He would be telling the people that I am the Messiah of the Messianic kingdom. And even though there's people among you right now who don't want to bear the yoke of Rome, and it's going to be a problem very soon, nevertheless, in my kingdom, you will be like the tents of Kedar. You won't have to wear a mere human's yoke. You won't have to bear the yoke of the beast, because no man's yoke is going to be upon the people of Israel. And it says Israel will not be afraid of any human being. They will be led erect, right? And so if you look at the ox in the picture, you see that the natural conformation of the ox is that his head is low. In fact, you're not going to believe this. I've actually ridden a longhorn before, a Texas longhorn, long story. That was the same day I shot a Thompson submachine gun. But at any rate, what you notice is different if you've ever ridden horses. When you ride an ox, is how low the head is. It's strange, completely different from riding a horse. It feels like the control center is way too low, and that's because they're built for a different job. They're built to bear the yoke, and so their head, their neck, is built low into their body. But he's saying that in the Messianic kingdom, Israel is not going to be like an ox. They're not going to have to keep their heads low to bear that yoke. They're not going to be afraid of any human being or his yoke, because that's not the yoke they will be carrying. They will have a very light yoke, which is the yoke of the kingdom. They will walk upright like human beings, not with their heads down like an ox. And that's a beautiful picture, because sometimes it does seem like the weight of the world is on our shoulders and our heads get down. And which I'll have to change the saying a little bit, but a friend of mine had a saying passed down to her from her grandmother, and her grandmother, an old Kentucky hill grandmother, used to say, when your rear end is dragging the ground, keep your head up. Just keep your head up. And that's a message to us, even when the weight of this world, and we have lots of weight right now, trying to drag us into those beastly systems, then don't forget to keep your head up and remember whose yoke you were created to wear. It's the yoke of the kingdom. You're not just an ox. And so in that sense, you can learn a lot from the Tents of Kedar. They avoid wearing the yoke of human beings. And we can add what we know of our yoke and say, rather than wear the yoke of human beings, which we all will to some extent, as long as we live in this world. You're in the world, you have to live in the world, but you don't have to be of the world. And if we can look forward to a time when we won't have to bear any of that heaviness of these beastly systems, and think of how light the yoke of the kingdom will be, that's pretty awesome. It also says, the people of Israel are like Joseph. Just as he was sold to the tents of Kedar, in other words, Ishmaelites, that's in Genesis 37:28, and subsequently he turned around and acquired those who acquired him, as it is stated, thus Joseph acquired all the land of Egypt. So too, in the Messianic age, the people of Israel will be captors over their captors. So in the Messianic kingdom, in that Messianic age, all these beastly systems, they're going to be dismantled. Messiah will be the king. He will rule with a rod of iron, and he will administrate. And so whatever parts of these systems are still good, I'm sure he'll still keep. But the parts of it that are simply more scales on the dragon, more offspring of the dragon, simply trying to take control to build a never-ending human kingdom that would make war against the heavenly kingdom, those things will be destroyed, brought down, taken captive. And once those things are taken captive, that's what we see. If we see him even as Messiah, son of Joseph, Mashiach ben Yosef, what does Joseph do? Even though he's sold into captivity in the land of Egypt, which represents the world and death in the world, Joseph ends up taking captivity captive. Because as you read what Joseph did in the years of the famine, he gradually acquires every single thing in the land of Egypt. Everything. He controls everything. And he does it within 7 years. And so if we look at the Messianic kingdom, we can see that the Messiah will do something similar. That all the things that have held us captive within probably a very short amount of time, he will take those systems captive. He will administrate everything in the kingdom, second only to the Father. Just like he says, this relationship between Pharaoh and Joseph being second in the land. Mashiach is going to administrate the world. And those who held us captive, because remember when he says to Thyatira, as the Father has given me to sit down on the throne, so I will give you thrones. I will give you authority even as I have been given authority. And so we will be part of his system, not the systems of the beast. We will be part of his systems. And therefore, all these things that held us captive, that maybe we've railed against, and it's easy to rail against things right now. We want to rail against the politicians. We want to rail against the inefficiency of government. We want to rail against the healthcare system. We want to rail against, you just fill in the blank there. And primarily, we rail, I think our group of people are railing against those things because we feel like they are running counter to the yoke of the kingdom, what we know righteousness is. And because we feel helpless against the, remember Leviathan, it said his influence extends around the whole world to the point that his head overlaps his tail, which is a description of how many beastly systems that he has set up, given thrones and authority to, that there is no way to come out of that world. And then Egypt represents that world. And then the beast are these offshoots, the spawn of the dragon. And so we rail against these systems. We feel helpless, and it troubles our spirit. It's vexing us to be in this world, to be in this land of Egypt, to be bound by these systems and entangled in these systems. And the caution here is, don't spend too much time railing against the system that it has the unintended effect of actually making you stick to it, because that's where your mind is all the time. You want to discern your time, but you want to spend the bulk of your time thinking on the heavenly things, thinking on the Torah, thinking on the application of his word. It's time spent in prayer, even time spent thinking about what you should pray about. When we pray, sometimes it's a result of accumulating little things in the conversations over the last few hours or the emails over the last few hours. And you're like, okay, I need to stop and pray because I've accumulated these little burdens. And so let me go ahead and pray. The more we spend our time doing those things, then the easier it's going to be to live among the beastly systems and yet not to stick to their scales. Because the more we're obsessed with it, we're still stuck to it. You can't be obsessing over the beastly systems because you'll be just as stuck to it as somebody that's actually bought into it. And neither one of those is a productive use of our time. In the Messianic age, that's going to drop away. And you will simply have that light yoke of the kingdom. I'm sure Messiah will have a job for each of us to do. And I think one of the jobs we're learning right now is how to take our captivity captive. Even though we are in exile, we can still acquire all the land of Egypt. And what do I mean by that? We can be in the world and yet control our environment. We can take every situation. And when people do this, it can be annoying. I understand, because if you're not there yet, it is annoying when you're around somebody who manages to find the good in everything. And you're just mad because you can't get your driver's license because it's shut down because of COVID. Or if you did get in line, then you would be in line for 3 hours. Or I can't even vote. Or Think about those things and acquire control of them. And I know you're sitting there right now, you're saying, how? How do I get control of that? Through the power of the Holy Spirit. And you're not going to do it just by deciding to. You're going to do it by practice and practice and practice and practice. And sometimes it might be the people you're around that he's like, okay, this time when we get together, we're going to have good, healthy, fruitful conversations. And then you get together and 5 minutes later, they have sucked you right down into that black hole of just being a sponge for every dark thing the beast has thrown out there today. And we have to quit being those sponges, because all a sponge does is absorb. And then when somebody squeezes it, all that come out is that ugly dark water, that gray water. We don't want to be gray water. When somebody squeezes us, that tends to be what comes out though. But if we know that we're in a time of tribulation, just like Joseph did, then he can take each bad situation and he can figure out how to turn it to the Pharaoh's good. We can take the situation and turn those situations to the Father's good. So if we are having to stand in line for 3 hours for something, well, rather than sit there and play on our phone or, gripe to the people in front and behind us, what if we figured out something good to say that might draw them into a conversation about Scripture, because they're going to be interested. You know things about Scripture and our present time that will interest even heathens. Even heathens are interested in the book of Revelation. Use the opportunity. Are you stuck, in the COVID testing line because you want to go someplace? You have to have a COVID test. You've been sitting in your car for the last 2 hours. All right. Listen to something good. Listen to the word. Put on a podcast. Read. Right? Never underestimate a good book. You can take every situation that we're railing against and acquire that land, acquire that opportunity, and dedicate it to the King of Kings. You can take captivity captive. That's the lesson of Joseph. He didn't just settle for the original plan, which was store up and then give people food. He kept adding to the plan. The worse it would get, the more he would turn the situation to Pharaoh's good. And I think that's our opportunity, our encouragement, and something for us to keep practicing and working on. Every situation, as it gets worse, say, okay, this is a heavy yoke right here. This is more than annoyance. This is vexing me. I'm going to acquire this situation in my life for the good of the King. I'm going to take the opportunity, and only you are going to know what to do with that opportunity, whether it's witnessing to someone, whether it's restructuring how you spend your time, whether it's disciplining your internet use to certain things, whether it's taking the lead and redirecting conversations at work. And people don't necessarily have to know you're doing it. They'll figure it out over time. But if you're the person in the lunchroom, when something wicked or horrible comes up, if you were to redirect it to something good, especially things of the Spirit, if you were to just naturally and gracefully redirect, don't judge, just redirect. You don't know how much good that's going to do to somebody who might be sitting there and they're up to their eyeballs with childcare, with bills, with health. We don't know what people are going through. And when we see everybody railing against the president or whichever one he is right now, whether we're railing against vaccinations, whatever it is we're railing against, we need to be careful. And then I thought of this last night in the conversation that I might need to redirect this, because there might be people in this chat room, or whatever you call it, who are up to their eyeballs with the heavy yoke. And we don't want to pile on when we actually have the good news. And so taking that opportunity, because a lot of times you're just too far into the conversation to redirect at the beginning and send it off in another direction. But once you're in it, and then you realize you're in it, you're like, doggone it, suck me in again. You can very gently begin to try to nudge it in another way. Or, I mean, if you have the ability, find something else to go do. If it's already, like a freight train going down the track, and you don't want to be like Wile E. Coyote trying to stop the train, just go do something else. Get your head clear, and then roll up your sleeves and get ready for the next battle. It's okay if you don't do it right every time. But if you just have in the back of your mind, no matter what I encounter today that tries to take my thoughts captive, I'm going to try to take it captive. I'm going to learn new techniques to take it. And if those things don't work, I'm going to try something else until I can turn the situations in my life, the conversations in my life, the challenges in my life, the troubles in my life. Somehow I am going to acquire that as the property of the King. We're going to take it back. And we can take it back. We just have to believe that the one who empowers us is greater than the dragon that is empowering the beast. That the authority Yeshua gives to us is just as valid and more than the authority that the serpent is giving to the beast, to all these systems. And when we believe it, we'll get better at acting upon it, seeing the beast coming and knowing how to redirect him, or knowing how to take him captive, so that he doesn't just suck us in. And so, continuing with the Midrash commentary here, it says, as the tents of Kedar are moved from place to place, so too are the people of Israel. Like we said, we're the nomads right now, until they are like the curtains of Solomon. And that is chapter 1, verse 5. Like the curtains of Solomon. So she's like the tents of Kedar, and she's also like the curtains of Solomon. And they point out that other than temple curtains that King Shlomo might have commissioned, there's no record, there's no mention anywhere that Melech Shlomo made any curtains. And so they point out that which I wrote world for some reason, the word Shlomo, which is Hebrew for Solomon, Shlomo can be translated his peace. And so they said this indicates that these curtains of King Shlomo that the text is talking about, remember, this is the beloved. She's black like the tents of Kedar. And she says, like the curtains of Solomon. She has the qualities of the curtains of Solomon. So she has the qualities of the curtains of him to whom peace belongs. In other words, to the Holy One. And so under these curtains is going to be his peace. And so in order to take it to the next step, we look at equivalent expressions. And I know we seem to do that every single Torah portion, but it's important to learn how to do it. Like I said last night, I'm trying to teach you everything I know, every tool in my toolbox, so that if I'm not here, you can just carry on. You know how to do what I do. I'm just the bag of bones. We're each just the bag of bones that is the tool. And it's our job, like Yeshua, to begin planning for our exit early, to teach other people to do what we do as much as possible. Now, they can't be us, but they can use the same tools and they can advance. They can take what we teach them and do even better. That's what a true teacher wants. The true teacher wants to see the student exceed him or her, to take what they've learned, be faithful to their gift and their mission, and enlarge the tent. So, equivalent expressions. Psalm 104, verse 2, it says, He spreads out the heavens like a curtain. And so the heavens are like a curtain. This beloved is like the curtains of Solomon, or like the curtains of him to whom peace belongs, to the one who made the heavens. So she is like the heavens that the Holy One spread out like a curtain. And then Isaiah 40, verse 22 says, and he stretched them like a tent to dwell in. And so there's an equivalency between a curtain and a tent. They're not identical. Remember, with an equivalency, you're not looking for the two things to be identical. The way that they're used is they are similar, but each one will teach you an important distinction. And so there is the heavens like a curtain, and then he stretched them like a tent. And so it's like the beloved is like the tent, or yeah, I said that right. Like the tent, like the curtain of King Shlomo, the one to whom peace belongs. So she is like the curtain. She is like the tent of the one to whom peace belongs. And then Isaiah 33:20 says, look upon Sion, the city of our appointed feasts. Your eyes will see Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, an undisturbed habitation. Now watch the contrast here between what she just said, like the tents of Kedar. There will be an era where she will be nomadic. She will be moving from place to place. But now, because we understand the equivalency of expression, because she comes in and she says, oh, and like the curtains of Melech Shlomo. Now we get the analogy. She's saying, I will be going from a nomadic person who has to celebrate the feasts all over the world. Very few people, percentage-wise, who want to be in Jerusalem for the feast are actually there. And probably fewer still who haven't yet figured out that's where they should be at the feasts. Much greater number, but they will figure it out. Because it says, look upon Sion, the city of our appointed feasts. Your eyes will see Jerusalem, an undisturbed habitation, a tent which will not be folded. Its stakes will never be pulled up, nor any of its cords be torn apart. So now we can understand what she's saying. She's talking about her history, that she will enter in, she is in an era of her exile. She is nomadic. She's going from place to place. She has to celebrate the appointed feasts in these places of her exile, of her traveling. And so she tears down the tent, folds it up, pulls up the stakes, travels, sets it down again for the next feast. Picks it all up, travels, sets it down again for the next feast. But in Isaiah, he says, this is going to change for her. This is going to change for the daughters of Jerusalem. And this is going to change for the one who is black but lovely, who has the treasures of the Torah inside. On the outside, she's just not looking like everyone else. She's a little sunburned. But there will come a time when she will no longer look like the Tents of Kedar in her celebrations, in her appointed feasts. Instead, she's going to be gathered to the holy city. She will no more have to set up her tent and take it down and move for the next feast. Instead, she is going to be part of the original creation. Because remember, the Moedim, the feasts of Adonai, were set in place on the 4th day of creation. Before human beings were ever created, on the 6th day, he spread out the heavens like a curtain. He stretched them like a tent to dwell in on the 2nd day of creation. He separated the waters from the waters. So he's stretching them out. He's creating these curtains, this tent on day 2 of creation. And it talks about the rakia, I can't call the word right now, the space, I'll come to it later. The thing that goes between them, that separates them after he stretches out the curtain in the tent, so that the upper and the lower waters are separated. And then on day 4, he sets the heavenly bodies in place, the sun and the moon and the stars, it says, for the sake of the Moedim. And so you have the sun and the moon that help us develop the calendar. And then what do the stars do? They're the children of Abraham. They are the witnesses to the Moedim. In fact, the passage that we'll read next week in Revelation talks about how the tail of the dragon swept a third of the stars out of the sky. He managed to sweep out a third of the witnesses to the Moedim. And he's cast down to earth. But this beloved who was dark and had to move with the feasts, she wasn't able to come to Jerusalem permanently. She didn't have access to Jerusalem for the feasts. He says, look upon Sion, this city of our appointed feasts. And then you're going to see Jerusalem, and you're going to see that this truly was a daughter of Jerusalem. She just didn't look like the other daughters. She was nomadic. But she will be settled in an undisturbed habitation. She will be under the canopy that was made for her on the 2nd day of creation. She will be inhabiting a tent which will never be folded up, because remember, Jerusalem above is that level of Jerusalem that will eventually, once the Jerusalem below is purified, once it's cleansed, once it's prepared, then you will see the spiritual Jerusalem once again descend. They will merge, they will marry, and they will be restored to the way that they were created in the garden. And it says it's never going to experience the same thing. In other words, Jerusalem above will never again withdraw. That human beings will continue to live out the intent of the Creator when he created them. And it's going to be so awesome when the world finally understands the feasts. And I'm not even going to say the way that we do, because we don't even understand the feasts. We're just tipping the surface of the feasts and what they mean, because they're so important. They're identified with Jerusalem being undisturbed, that's never going to be pulled up. It's never going to be folded up. The cords are never going to be pulled apart. That we will dwell in that tent forever. And that's good news. And I say, if you're standing in a line And, sometimes people don't want to be talked to. But I'm on a plane. I typically do not want to be talked to. I want to sleep. And if you get a chatty seatmate, you're kind of stuck with them for the duration. But again, take that land for the king, chat back. And you start bringing up stuff like this. You figure out what their level is, what they know, what they don't know. You speak into that level, and they'll either shut up and leave you alone, or they'll start talking back, and you will have a chance to sow some seed into that situation that you thought you were held captive with a seatmate or standing in line. And as it turned out, you weren't captive at all. You took it captive. And you gave that property, you gave that ground to the King of Kings. And, to me, the feast is something you can always testify to. More and more, it's odd that you would think we would need to do this, especially in the Western world. More and more, you need to proclaim the testimony of Yeshua and the resurrection from the dead, because this many paths to God garbage has so infested our culture, media, books, education curriculum. We really do have to start fighting back with that message. We can't assume that, especially a younger generation, even understands resurrection from the dead and the law of sin and death, and why you need to know about the resurrection so that you can be a part of it in an enduring way, an enduring good way, because there's also an enduring bad way to take part in the resurrection, at least the second resurrection. Okay, and I don't know if those are the Tents of Kedar, but I just thought they were pretty because you can see the heavens, the tent, like the picture of the physical tent we know we're in, but yet we can look up at the stars, especially at the time of the feast, and know that that tent, those stars, they cover Jerusalem, yes, but that same tent is covering us wherever we are until we can go home. So I think I just said all that. And that takes us to the next verse, where she's going to give us even more details. Where, at first she says, I'm black but lovely, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. And now in verse 6, she's going to be a little more intensive with it, a little more explanatory with it. She's going to say, I'm trying to turn this alarm off, and there we go. She's going to say, do not stare at me because I'm swarthy. She's bringing up the same point. I'm swarthy, I'm black, I'm dark. And she says why she's dark now. She's told you how she's dark, the reason she's dark. And then she's going to give you another reason. And next week, we're going to talk about this. It says, for the sun has burned me. We're going to talk about what the sun is. And it's something we probably all know. Because if you're sitting here right now, you've got more than your toes in the water of the Torah. And you realize that we have all been a little sun-singed. That we have all been out there, maybe caught in systems that were derivatives of idolatry. And of course, the sun worship is kind of if you want to say idolatry and include all the gods in the world, then sun worship would be the one thing you would say that would be all-inclusive. Because there's 365 days in the year. And there was a particular day of the year, it said that Israel tried to incorporate every single god they could come into contact with. And on that day of the year, it was like the Sunday, where it incorporated everything. whether it was Baal Peor, whether it was Molech, whatever it was. It would include that. And so again, we know there's offspring. These systems just keep reinventing themselves. And so some of us have been sun singed. And she explains what that means. But we're also going to look at do not stare at me because I am swarthy. Because it's a more intensive way. In other words, she says, I'm black but lovely. And apparently they're still looking at her in a not so nice way, in a disapproving way. And that's why I said, where we're going with this, and we'll save it for next week because of time. But in other words, she's saying, you're staring at me with a gaze of contempt. I've told you who I am, but you're still looking at me contemptuously. And so the sages point to Proverbs 30:10. It says, do not slander a slave to his master, or he will curse you, and you will be found guilty. The master will curse you for slandering his slave. And they say, well, who are the slaves? Leviticus 25:55 says the people of Israel are called servants. As it is stated, for the children of Israel are servants to me. And then they say also the prophets. Amos 3:7 says he doesn't do anything unless he has revealed his secret to his servants, the prophets. So the servants that must not be slandered to Adonai are the children of Israel and his prophets. And what we'll do is we'll go into a deeper investigation of what exactly that means and how even Elijah, when he's complaining about Israel and he's complaining about their idolatry, how basically he gets a smackdown from Adonai for slandering Israel. And what he did, and I know I'm going into it too soon. We'll save it for next week. But what he did is he confused himself with the Holy One. And so the breaking down the text will help us understand when sometimes when we think we're calling out sin and asking for God to avenge himself on our enemies, what we've actually done is inserted ourselves as their masters. And it can happen very easily. It can happen without our being aware of it. When we get tired, when we're tired of being chased, like Jezebel was chasing Elijah, because we're human, we can slide into that mode. But it doesn't mean we can't begin to recognize it and be careful of it and ask ourselves the question. When I'm asking, because remember, the one benediction in the Shmoneh Esrei, the 18 benedictions, that we know it wasn't part of the original, and it's a curse against the Notzrim. Where they're like, take vengeance against them. That doesn't belong in there. You know, the parts that we love are like, you know, make my soul like dust to everyone. You can tell when you read that benediction, that was not in the original prayer, and it doesn't belong there, and it's going to be taken out at some point to return it to the 18 benedictions instead of the 19 it created. And that's just some examples. So we'll talk about that more next week. That's just kind of where we were going, but that did come up last night. Now that this could be a teachable moment here. Let's see, stop share. And also I wanted to bring up to anybody, because I think the recorder's still going. When I did the Torah portion last week, I had not yet put together some things. Remember I said I was looking at December the 27th to just see what in the world how could the hook be set in Pharaoh's jaw? on December the 27th. Well, I kept digging and I found some stuff. And so I didn't have it when I did the Torah lesson last week, but I had it by the time I did the live stream on Shabbat. So if you haven't heard that, I don't know at what point. It's on the end of the presentation. It's on the very end of that live stream that I did on Shabbat. You can fast forward on YouTube, fast forward there close to the end. And you'll see on the PowerPoints when you'll see the PowerPoints you had for your Torah lesson, and then you'll see some new ones. That's the point where maybe you'd want to fast forward and then pick up right there, and you would get the additional information about the year of the midwife, which is really important because it tells us where we are, what we need to be looking for, and what we need to be doing.